one problem when you're talking about why C++, and that's the other side of the question. Why not C++? It's all power, performance, control, it's popular, it's general purpose. Why isn't everybody using it? Well, you may have heard that it's hard. I gotta kind of disagree. Modern C++ is really not hard. What's probably got you nervous about C++ that someone else has told you or that you remember from a long time ago are things that really aren't in modern C++. So the first thing about modern C++ is using the standard library. The standard library has a string class in it. The standard library has great collections and smart pointers that take care of memory management. Like, you do not have to delete memory that you allocated with new. And it has file I/O, screen I/O, and far too much to list. The same way if you've done .NET programming, it comes with a library of bits and pieces. You've done Java programming, it comes with a library of bits and pieces, and C++ comes with a library of bits and pieces called the standard library. This isn't something that you get around to later once you're good at it. This is something you do from the beginning, using these out-of-the-box capabilities for your string manipulations, for your collections, to spare you the trouble of memory management or pointer arithmetic or a lot of the stuff that people kind of get afraid of. Modern C++ is powerful, but it's still readable and it's not dangerous. Managing memory yourself, that's last century's C++. That is not what we're going to be doing. It's not what is expected of people who are writing ordinary C++ applications. A little bit different if you're writing a library. If you just want to write an application, you're not going to manage memory, and that means you're not going to get all caught up in a lot of the dangers of managing your own memory, pointer arithmetic, those kinds of things. In fact, when I show modern C++ to people who know C# or to people who know Java, what they tend to say with a tremendous amount of surprise is, I can read that, and they're not expecting it. We've all heard the joke, or at least those of us who work in C++ have heard the joke, it's like a bunch of comic book characters swearing at each other. And we do have a lot of different pieces of punctuation in C++, and they serve purposes rather than just using dot for everything. But when you look at modern C++, you'll be able to read it if you know C# or Java. What's cool is how much faster it is. Let me just give you one example. Java and C# both have generics, the idea that you have a list of somethings or a queue of somethings, and C++ has them too. C++ has templates. Now, generics are resolved at runtime. That means every time your application runs, some number of cycles are going to be spent figuring out, what type do I use, what method do I call, what's going on here. Templates in C++ are resolved at compile time. That means those cycles are not spent at runtime. The application's just plain faster as a result. And those kind of advantages keep showing up when you're working in C++. That's why it's the first choice for speed of execution. So if it's readable, it's not complicated, it doesn't have to be hard, and it's just flat out faster, now you're starting to see why C++ is such a popular language. So at least for a moment, bear with me that you agree that C++ is a great language to learn and a great language to use because it's so general purpose and cross-platform and powerful and performant, and that although you've heard it's hard, you're prepared to believe that modern C++ is maybe not hard. Now, if you already know C# or Java or some other language featuring brace brackets and semicolons, you may feel like, okay, I can do this. I'm going to learn this hard thing, even though I've told you it's not really hard. But surely someone who doesn't know a programming language already should never start with something as terrifying as C++. Well, I disagree. I think C++ is a fine first language. When I started to learn to program, we had less languages to choose from. But even 20 years ago, when I've been doing C++ for a while, it was still a really popular first programming language. Generations of people learned C++ and got out in the world and turned into decent programmers, whether they ended up working long-term in C++ or not. It's certainly true that compared to the kind of C++ that was being taught 20 years ago, C# and Java are way easier. But, you know, that's like comparing a car to like a wood-fired steam engine or something and thinking that that's saying anything about cars versus trains. Modern C++ is not too hard for beginners. Many of the things that used to have to be done right at the very beginning around memory management and pointer arithmetic and doing a whole lot of stuff by hand, that's just not part of modern C++. You have a library that helps you, the same as those other languages have libraries that help you, and you have some very powerful constructs to keep you safe while you're having high performance applications. So even if you don't know another programming language, why not get started with C++? Now in this material, I'm not going to be covering basic programming concepts like what is a loop and why are things sometimes true and sometimes false, but you don't need to feel that, oh, I can't learn C++ because I don't know some other language. It's fine if this is the first language that you take on. If you do happen to know C# or Java, then you're going to learn C++ pretty quickly because you're going to recognize a lot and say, oh, that's just like what I already knew. Now, there are some things that are different, so don't get too overconfident. If you know old school C++, if you're one of those people who says, well, you know what, I worked with this 10 years ago and now I have to come back to it, you may actually have a tougher time because you're going to have to unlearn some things that were beaten into you that you really don't need to worry about so much anymore, and you can relax a little and trust a little. And I will show you how it's really all going to be okay. And if you don't know any programming languages yet, welcome aboard. You're going to have to look a little elsewhere for sort of concepts of programming languages, but you don't need to already know C or C# or Java in order to grasp the concept of C++. You can learn it as your first language. I'd like to clear up a little nomenclature before we dig into the actual heavy-duty details of syntax and library and all of that. You may have heard of C++/CLI, and to be honest, people sometimes misabbreviate this or they put dots in there. If you've heard C++ and CL something together, this is probably what they were trying to remember. You know, there are a number of languages that are sort of based on C++. After all, there's this huge pool of developers that already know the syntax. So you say, my language has the same syntax as C++, except for this one little thing. And very often, these variants will work with libraries that are already out there and with tools that are already out there, maybe with a little bit of extension or modification. And this is a powerful way to bring new capabilities to that pool of C++ developers. And C++ CLI is one of those variants, and it makes managed code. So once upon a time, before there was a .NET framework, before there was Java, there was C++, and it compiled to machine code on the machine that you were building on. Nowadays, we call that native code because we need to distinguish that native code that actually runs directly on the metal from code that runs against some kind of a runtime, whether it's a Java runtime or a C# .NET framework runtime, or you're writing in VB.NET and running against the .NET framework's runtime. Normal, ordinary C++ produces native code, and Microsoft has compilers that come in Visual Studio that make native code. But it also has a set of tools inside Visual Studio that can make managed code from C++ source code. Managed code that can be easily called from C# or VB or any other kind of managed code you have kicking around. It does this with some extensions to the language itself, so it's not C++, it's C++ CLI, because it's a little different, has a few extra keywords in it, a few extra pieces of punctuation. And this is a fantastic way to take a native library that was maybe written a long time ago and wrap it up, put a wrapper around it to make it easy to call from .NET code. I'm not going to cover C++ CLI at all. If you learn C++, then you basically know C++ CLI as well. You just need to learn the few extra little pieces of punctuation and keywords, and you're good to go, and you'll be in a position to write those wrappers. But we are not going to have any C++ CLI content. We're all about native code. Something else you may have heard or read is C++ OX. In order to understand what that is, we need to sort of back up a little bit to who owns C++. The answer is kind of nobody. You know, one person sat down and invented it, Bjarne, the father of C++, and a number of different compiler vendors make C++ compilers. But the owners of those compilers can't arbitrarily decide to change the language. So take a language like Visual Basic, which eventually became Visual Basic.NET. That's just a language that Microsoft developed and owns. And if they want to add a keyword to it, they just add a keyword to it. C++ isn't like that. It's got a standard that says, here are the keywords in this language, and the standard library that I mentioned is part of the standard. So there's a standards committee, and they get together and decide whether or not to add a keyword or a piece of punctuation. They decide whether or not to add some capabilities to the library. The current version before C++ OX was technically C++ 03, but most people called it C++ 98 because 03 was just little kind of tweaky updates. And to be honest, most people just called it C++ and didn't have any idea what the year was from. Back when the 03 version finished, there were people saying, okay, let's get going on the next one. It's going to be something, we don't know what. It'll be sometime before 2009. And right away, the joke was, I hope X doesn't need to be a hexadecimal digit, which of course it did. Eventually, it'll probably be 11 or 12. It's pretty much done now, has to go through some hoops, and it'll end up being C++ 11 or C++ 12. Of course, we'll just call it C++. There's some new functionality added, some new keywords, some new punctuation, and a lot of very cool stuff in the library, and we'll just use it. And we won't really remember a time when that wasn't there. You know, I remember a time when certain keywords weren't in C++, but I don't go around saying, you're using that keyword. Geez, that was only added in 1998. That's very modern of you. And it'll be the same with these C++ OX keywords. They'll just be normal. They'll just be what C++ has in them. Now, the Standards Committee is an interesting mix of people from compiler vendors, people who just care about the language, people who use the language a lot, people from academia, and so on. And the compiler vendors, it's all been a completely open and transparent process. When they could see, yes, we all agree on this, and no matter how long the whole standard gets to put together, one particular aspect is going to be adopted for sure, they started to put that capability into the compilers. So Visual Studio 2010, which has already been released, supports all of the library changes in C++ OX and almost all the language changes. So if you're using Visual Studio 2010, including the Express Edition, you can just work with the C++ OX features that I'm going to show you in this course and never particularly know whether they're added just now or whether they're from 10 years ago or 20 years ago or whatever. Just to be on the safe side, when I show you something that's from C++ OX, I will point it out so that if you have some C++ experience from the past and you say, wait, I don't think that's a keyword, you'll get a little bit of a reminder that it's a new keyword so that you don't feel that something strange has happened when you weren't looking. Ready to write some code? I've shown you that C++ is a powerful language that's used by 10 million developers and more, and it's rich in libraries and sample code, works across a variety of platforms, and gives you tremendous performance. That's what it's all about. Sure, you may have heard that it's a difficult language, but it doesn't have to be, especially if you write modern C++. It's clean, it's simple, and it lets the standard library do a lot of the work. Things that you think are too difficult to do by hand, you probably don't have to do by hand. Things that you think are hard to read if you do it the 1990 C++ way, don't have to be hard to read at all if you do it the modern C++ way. That's what I'm going to focus on and show you, and you're going to be productive from the very beginning using C++.